Welcome to day one of the BFI Future Film Festival 2022. This year's festival is bigger than ever before. It's a hybrid model, so we have an exciting program of events, both in venue at the BFI South Bank here in London, and also lots of free online events. So you can check them all out over on the BFI website over the coming 3 days. My name is Anna Bogutska, and I'm so excited to be hosting today's hotspot with the multi-talented actor, writer, producer, and director, Rebecca Hall. So I really wanted to go back and kind of start by asking you about your own relationship with film, with movies. I know you come from a theater family, but were you always a film fan as well?
Yes, I was. From a very young age. I think it was sort of my way of carving out some sort of independence in relation to the family that I came from. I was definitely interested in the same things that my family were interested in, did for a living, but I loved acting on the stage and I liked the idea of performance from quite little, but I think I discovered that a little bit later, like a love for theatre. My first encounter with anything, I guess anything artistic, honestly, that I connected to personally, that I discovered by myself was film. And I was an only child. I have a bunch of half siblings, but I was an only child. So I was, on my own in various houses quite a lot. And both of my parents had very, obviously sophisticated, cultured taste in movies. So there were a lot of, in those days, VHSs, videos, that'll be. So I would spend a lot of time just sticking them on and seeing what I got, which was sometimes a little bit disturbing in the instance of Don't Look Now and The Shining when I was probably 11 years old. But, like, oh dear. But also, my mother was a real champion of, she was American, and she I think it was a sort of connection to home for her. So she had a really passionate and sort of collectible library of golden age of Hollywood movies, black and white movies, everything from Frank Capra to Hitchcock to, Barbara Stanwyck, Katharine Hepburn, all those people. And that was my childhood. I would just sit on my own and watch black and white movie after black and white movie after black and white movie. And I couldn't get enough of those films. I even remember, like, when my friends would come around, I would really nerd out on them, which is not cool if you're sort of like a group of 12-year-olds being like, hey, let's watch a Katharine Hepburn movie. Everyone was like, I don't know what's wrong with this person. But then I started like wising up and realizing that I could probably tread a line between, just like weirdly out on a limb and cool. When I started showing them things like Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, then they got intrigued. My friends were like, this is kind of scary and also maybe cool. I don't know.
I mean, as an only child who tried to show my 7-year-old classmates The Wizard of Oz and got booed out of the classroom, highly relatable.
You relate. Okay, right.
And I wanted to ask you, Arsa, you talk about this love of discovering old Hollywood and classic cinema. Were there any particular stories that you, or filmmakers even, that you found yourself drawn to over the years and as you kind of grew up and started, working in and relating to performance and to film in a more mature way?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it started with Golden Age of Hollywood, and that sort of naturally pushed me into the evolution of American cinema and the sort of huge explosion in the 60s and 70s of all of those, those dudes, a lot of which are still around. But, there was I remember being profoundly affected by films like Midnight Cowboy for some reason. I found that very moving. There was something, there's a kind of, I suppose I was always drawn to things that had a slightly offbeat narrative, and that maybe even with, I guess, a queer subtext. I grew up in a very sort of queer environment, actually, my mum's friends, and sort of, and that was very, the kind of, sometimes a kind of heightened level of camp was very appealing to me. So there was things that kind of that was sort of colored in that direction that I started. And that took me into places like Derek Jarman as I got older. And then became completely sort of had my mind blown by Derek Jarman several times over. I loved the sloppiness of it, you know, that there's a sort of experimental sloppiness that I feel we're not allowed so much anymore, that you see in those films, certainly the kind of messy films of the like 70s and early 80s as well, that kind of scene that was very kind of deconstructed in a way. And I found that very creative. So from there, you kind of go to Peter Greenaway, and then you kind of stumble across Mike Leigh, and then but then I also, went from that avenue into European cinema. And then, when I opened that can of worms, it was sort of, oh, Fellini. Okay, here we go. So, and then I go full circle back to sort of older films of the European bent, and French cinema. Les Diaboliques was a big one for me when I was young. I remember coming across that film and being completely captivated by this sort of Hitchcock elements that I was familiar with, but also this sort of the freedom in terms of the gender relationships, the two women, and the whole thing was just unusual in American cinema, but had a kind of bit more of a history in European cinema. And then, Polish, Russian, the whole thing. I could keep going. I could nerd out for a long time about my film.
We can have this whole conversation just about film history, but that might be for another event.
Not going to be that interesting, but if anyone wants a list of recommended.
and kind of from that clearly very deep cinephilia that you were growing up with and discovering for yourself, and this attention to the sort of the vibe or the messiness or certain types of characters or certain types of stories, did you have, kind of looking back at your career, did you have a particular idea of the sort of performances, the sort of roles, or even the sort of film career? Because I know you started and did a lot of work in theater very early on, but with film, did you have a specific vision for yourself?
A woman who could carve out a career as a leading actor who was also a character actor, who was able to explore, who was able to not just be a version of themselves that looked good in a dress, I suppose. And I could see that there were many, many men who were able to do that, and it didn't even get remarked upon. And even when I was, starting out, it was very difficult for a woman to carve out that, as an actress, to carve out that kind of a niche for themselves. I wanted to be able to play messy, ugly, angry, sloppy people who have all the colors and go to in all the places. And that, it's only just, it's increasingly acceptable for women to do that. And I think that we're at a bit of a watershed moment where I feel it's going to be much more the norm, and there will be many more stories that are like that. I mean, you see it increasingly all the time. So I feel optimistic about that. But when I was starting out, it was definitely a sort of strange direction for a 20-something to want to go in. I remember someone saying to me early on, after I'd got a couple of film jobs, I remember someone saying to me, it's really fascinating that you're prepared to look ugly on screen. And I remember thinking, yeah, but if you're not, how do you ever stand a chance of telling honest stories? Like, this is life, everyone looks all the things all the time.
Right, and also it's hardly something that anybody would remark to a male actor.
Never in a million years. No. Then it's sort of brave and noble to do that kind of thing. You just look real. You look real.
And was the idea of, before we kind of move on to passing, did you ever have the idea or the ambition, even in the back of your head, starting out, of doing other roles in film that were not kind of on the screen?
Yes, always, actually. Always. From when I was really small, even before I really wanted to be an actor on film, I was writing stories and sort of imagining them as films, or wanting to, record people on camcorders and then try and work out how to edit it together. That's been my sort of real place of creativity for as long as I can remember. I think I just got sidetracked by the good fortune of success. I don't, you know, an acting career is so difficult to come by, a working one. You know, and I had all the good fortune and all the entitled privilege and all the rest of it that you can possibly imagine in terms of being in the right place at the right time. So, you know, on some level, of course, if I was any good, it was going to work out. But I think I underestimated how hard it is when you feel lucky that something's panning out to then turn your back on it and do something else, you know. And I think I felt that for a long time, but there was always this little voice in the back of my mind being like, just, you don't have to take that job because, you know, for whatever reason it is, because it feels like it might be good for your career, or you need to pay the bills, or whatever it is. You don't have to take that job. Just like sit it out. Maybe you don't have so much money for a while. Just write your screenplay, Rebecca. Just do it. That was hard. That took some time to actually have the bravery to say no to something and do something else. But I always wanted to.
Did you ever nurture that desire kind of in other ways, perhaps not in ways where, you know, you were actively going out and pitching projects or pitching yourself as someone who wanted to do that, who always had that ambition, but how did you keep that little flame of ambition alive as, you know, your career grew bigger and more successful?
I honestly have no idea. I think it's just that the stuff I was doing did feed that side of myself. Not fully, but it fed enough of it to sustain it. You know, every time you take part in the filmmaking is, you know, a collaborative process, and it's a team sport, if you will. And everyone it's, you know, there's a captain and all the rest of it, but everybody is involved in the end product of telling that story. And I think as an actor, I derived a lot of pleasure from piecing together how every film I ever worked on, I was imagining how the cut would be, or, you know, I would count the setups and then piece together how they might edit it. And I'd imagine it in my head. And then I'd go and see the film and I'd be shockingly disappointed. Often I would be a little disappointed. And then sometimes I would be really surprised because it was way beyond my possible imagining, but it could be more than often it would be that way. But I think that sort of kept me going, you know, because also I learned so much from getting you know, such access to how it all works and how people make movies.
And I think there's something really interesting that you mentioned about kind of this moment of bravery of just saying no to a job or deciding, actually, let's just do it. Let's just try it. And I think that's something very relatable for people trying to get into film or trying to get their, you know, finding their footing in the industry.
Yeah, well, time is, I mean, I'm talking about something that was, you know, I had a very nice trajectory in the sense that I was getting paid. I was in a comfortable position to say no to something and concentrate on writing for a bit. Most people don't have that luxury, especially when you're starting out, and it's difficult to find the time. And you're always in that place of, you know, I'm working these bar shift hours and doing this day job, and now I've got 2 hours to write quick, better do it through the night or whatever it is. And that is really hard. So sometimes it's not even about bravery, it's just about finding the time. And I appreciate that. But, you know, I do think that I think it's telling if you find yourself at 2 a.m. writing for 4 hours, knowing that you've got to get up to go to work and you're going to be exhausted. And if you're that person, then this is for you. You'll keep doing it. You know, nothing's going to stop you, really.
Was there a moment that made you decide, actually, now is my time. Now is the time that I need to try and do this. I need to try to adapt this book, make this film. I need to try to direct a film for myself.
No, I actually intended to have a much sort of softer entrance into it. I wrote Passing a long time ago. I wrote Passing 15 years ago, really. And it sat in a drawer for about 6 years, maybe 7. And then I got it out and I was actively trying to get people to give me the funding for it for another 7 years. So, you know, 8, so I'm getting the timeline wrong, but somewhere around there. And so there wasn't really a moment. There was definitely a moment where I got it out of the drawer and said, I want this, I want to direct this. And I thought it would happen quicker because I was ready, you know, which is terribly arrogant. Like, I'm ready now. I'm finally ready to be a director. Let's go. And then you wait for 7 years for people to give you the money. It's not really up to you, I think, is what I'm trying to say. You know, it happens when somebody signs the check, and then you're off to the races. And whatever, you know, deliberation, maybe I'm not ready, maybe I am ready, who knows, that goes out the window, because if someone has signed the check, you've just got to do it. You know, the train has left the station, and then once the train has left the station, in my experience, once you're in that sort of role of, oh, it's really happening, pre-production is happening, there is no stopping. I mean, you don't have a moment to take a breath and go, hang on a minute, maybe I'm not ready, or I don't know enough about this, or how am I going to handle this? There actually isn't time for any of that, which is quite nice in many ways.
So I wanted to ask you as well, kind of specifically on passing, kind of what you say you wrote the script 15 years ago. Can you talk a little bit about what was it about this book that really, you know, I read in another interview that you did that you sort of saw it in your head as you were reading it as a movie. What was it about that book that had never been adapted before that sort of clicked for you as a film?
It just mapped perfectly onto all my interests. I had a personal connection to it because my grandfather and my mother arguably were both African American and passed white. My grandfather pretty, you know, made a choice. My mother did it by inheritance, if you see what I mean, as indeed have I. So I saw something of the psychology of these women and the toll on a psyche of a life lived in hiding, or a life born into hiding even, that I could relate to. And it was startling to me that I had never come across a story or a piece of art that had really, A, contextualized something so relevant to my history, but B, told a story of the history of Black women's inner emotional lives as seen through the gaze of one another, you know, not an external gaze.
So you haven't ever thought to?
What?
I'm asking if you ever thought of passing, Rena.
No, why should I? I mean, for convenience, occasionally, I suppose, but no. I just mean I have everything I've ever wanted, except perhaps a little more money.
In fact, all things considered, I think it's entirely worth the price.
And it had all these undercurrents of, yes, it's about race, but it's also about female friendship. It's also about repressed homosexuality. It's also about gender. It's also about ambivalence around being a mother or a wife. How it's ultimately about how much freedom does anybody, whoever you are, have to be who they want to be. I mean, we all like to say that sort of thing a lot. We're really in a culture of, you know, just be true to yourself and everything's fine. But sometimes it's like, well, what is me? And how free am I to actually be me? Like, the choices that I make about me, where do they come from? Do they come from my parents? Do they come from aspects of culture that I've internalized? In which case, that could be complicated because there's plenty that's wrong with our culture. So race overrides everything, is what I'm saying, and becomes the system of oppression and the framework from within they are left to try and work out who they want to be. And they have very little freedom, actually, despite being cultured, sophisticated, on some level bourgeois sort of women. You know, there's this other thing that they're living in. And I think it's universal, you know. And I don't know that it's rare. to see a story about two women of color and their emotional lives, and for, you know, not to get too granular about this, but specifically for white audiences to look at that and say, oh, this relates to me, as opposed to looking at it like it's a museum piece or a history lesson. It's like, no, this is actually about me now, can be about me now. And that felt very radical, actually. And I had never seen that on film. So it seemed obvious, you know, it was everything that I'm interested in. And I could see the film. I could just see it exactly how it was made. And it's not the, you know, it's funny because the script came out of me pretty fast, and I had written other things, but I hadn't really written a screenplay. I thought about it, but I was young. I was like 25 or whatever. So yes, I was 25, by the way, all you 25-year-olds in the audience.
Come out of you, did that flow out naturally, despite never having written a feature film screenplay?
Yeah, the first draft came out in 10 days.
Wow.
I didn't sleep much. I was in LA actually trying to get a job. I remember I was staying in someone's house in their pool house. So LA. And I was out there, you know, being a young 25-year-old actress. I was going to all the auditions and doing all the hello meet and greets, please cast me in things, I'm an up and coming actor. And then I was going home and I was typing furiously this sort of harebrained dream, sort of crazy pipe dream of an idea, this very ambitious movie. So it was a little schizophrenic in that sense, because I was sort of going out to people during the day and being like, this is who I am. And then at night I was like, no, I'm a filmmaker. And I have this like serious vision for something that is so, but it did also overwhelm me and frighten me, because once it was done, you know, after the 10 days that it took to write it, I remember looking at it and going, I'm out of my mind. Like nobody, like certainly not a 25-year-old, nobody makes this film, the seminal text, in this ambitious formal way, in black and white, in 4:3, all these ideas I had then. I just thought, I'm not ready. I'm never going to be able to do this. Like I should go and do something else, and then I should come back to this, because I'm not going to ever let anyone else direct it. So I was scared of it. So that's why it went in a drawer. And then I wrote other things, you know, and tried to make them.
A little bit worried that someone would come along before you and try to make it.
Yeah, but I was a little bit fatalistic about it, because I think at the time, you know, I convinced myself, even though I didn't really believe this, but, you know, in the way that your conscious mind definitely talks yourself out of things, and while your unconscious mind is saying something else. I was definitely doing that. I was, in my head, I was like, well, that was just an exercise, because I felt really passionately about this book. So I had to see if I could write a screenplay. So I might as well have adapted that one. It was only 97 pages. So, you know, it felt manageable. It was a really difficult script to adapt. You know, nothing happens and nobody says anything to anyone. And it's all pretty much told from the perspective of inside Irene's head. And she never has a conversation with anyone else about what's going on inside her head. So it was actually very difficult. In retrospect, I see that it was very difficult to adapt. But at the time, I was like, yeah, this is just an exercise. This is just for me. I'll never show it to anyone. It's unnecessary, blah, blah, blah. I just had to get it out of my system.
Once you decided to actually show it to other people, and I find it fascinating that you had such a clear stylistic vision of it from the very start, all those years ago. And the words that you use, kind of the story is radical, all the layers of it, the specificity and the universality of it. How was it for you to actually take it out, you know, for lack of a better expression, to market, to pitch it to people, to pitch yourself as well? Rebecca Hall, hi, I want to direct this radical black and white 4:3 movie based on a novel that's never been adapted.
Hard. I think that you have to adopt a persona as a director a little bit. And I don't mean this in a sort of aggressive way, because I think when you actually get to making the film, I think the persona needs to disappear a bit, because I think it's more important that my version of leadership definitely feels like it should come from an honest place. If someone asks you a question you don't know, you say, I don't know. And you get everyone to do their best work by making them feel supported and at ease. And that's not necessarily about being, I am auteur, grand dame, whatever. And, but I think when you have to do things like pitch meetings, and even sometimes when you have to do press, I think there has to be a little bit of a creation of, yourself as a director writer, because it's really hard. It's really hard because you never stop feeling, no matter how sure you are about your ideas, and I was very sure that my ideas were absolutely right, you still have those private moments when you're like, this is crazy. I'm out of my mind. No one's going to accept this in a million years. And you can't let that person into the room when you go into those places and trying to convince people that, your film deserves however much money it needs. I was initially going into rooms asking people for a lot of money, because this was initially a very expensive film. I wanted to build more sets. I wanted so I could have more fancy lighting effects. I wanted, period films are expensive. The costumes are expensive. The details are expensive. The car hires, the extras, whatever it is. So initially I was going into rooms with frightening people, asking them for a lot of money. And you have to be ridiculously confident to do that. And I don't know that I don't know. I think I just created a persona that was really, no one is better at this than me. So goodbye, everybody. Give me the money.
I find this very helpful for pitching yourself as well. What was this persona like? And how did it change as the kind of the
Well, it's like anything. It's not, it's not a lie. Like, there is a little kernel of myself that does believe, like, yeah, I'm really good at this. I know I can be really good at this, even though I hadn't done it. I was like, I know that I will kill this. And you just have to find that little, even if it's tiny compared to all the other crazy things inside you, find that little kernel that's saying that thing and just turn the volume up on it. Just concentrate on that one and just let it sing. Like, yeah, why not? Because actually, I think one of the advantages I had in helping me form this, alter ego person is that I saw a lot of directors' work. I saw a lot of first-time directors' work, and as an actor, and I witnessed that everybody does it differently, and there's this sort of feeling when you're on the outside of it, wanting to get in and wanting to do it. There's this feeling that there are all these secrets somewhere behind a door, and you've got to learn them all before you have the right to say anything. And it's absolutely not true. Nobody knows more than you because it's your movie. So you know everything there is to know about it, and no one will ever know more than you. Doesn't matter how many films they've made, how much they know about lenses, jargon, this and that, doesn't matter. You're the one who knows because you made it up in your head and you're walking around with it.
I'm particularly kind of interested in how intensely and personally female this film is. The point of view of it, the story. Did you notice particularly, and maybe this has shifted, I do see the shift as well in the types of characters that are thriving and allowed to exist on screens, both in TV and film, but did you notice a particular resistance or a desire to sort of manipulate the story that you felt you had to protect as you were making it?
Yeah, and I don't even think it came from a creative place. I mean, sometimes it just came from a sort of like brass tacks kind of place. I remember some financiers saying to me, yeah, no, it's really great. We could definitely give you some money. Any chance that you could make the male characters a bit larger? And I'm like, you mean Brian, the husband? Oh no, I'm thinking John and maybe Hugh Wentworth. I'm like, oh, so you want the white men to be a little bit larger in the story. Now, nobody said that, but that's what they were saying. Absolutely. And that was very challenging. And I called them out on it. I wasn't afraid to do that and say, you know, because the marketplace is such that, you know, nobody wants to admit this, but there has been historically some things will be more acceptable, yada, 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 whatever it is, whatever nonsense that we're dealing with. Anyway, I called people out on it, and that helped actually, because I think when it had been drawn attention to where their biases were landing, it was obviously preposterous. I was like, this isn't a movie about the men. It's a movie about these two women. So that would be a violation, a disservice. It doesn't make any sense. It will kill the film. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't afraid to be incredibly stubborn, because after that came, we'll give you the money if you make it in color, or we'll give you the money if you know, change this and this and this. And I wouldn't ever, because I never thought the reasons were true to Nella Larsen's story. I thought they were true to commerce and how the world works, and dumb inbuilt systemic racism. So, you know, that they weren't reasons to change anything. Sometimes people give you good notes, and there is reason to change things that will be helpful, that will, you know, this isn't about going in being very narrow-minded and closed off. You have to be a collaborator. You have to listen to all the voices in the room, but you do have to filter out the why people are saying things. Where is this coming from? And that's tricky. Maintain your North Star, you know.
And can you talk a little bit about kind of your approach to collaboration on this? Especially as a first-time director, kind of how did you learn, and what was the most useful learning really from both the protecting of the vision and also allowing space for collaborators, for notes, for other people to input on it to make it better?
I think that it's a very difficult thing to balance, what you're talking about, because it's very easy when you have been fiercely protecting an idea for 15 years, it's very easy to get defensive and not hear what people are suggesting. And I was aware of this. It was something that, you know, I storyboarded every shot meticulously. I drew every frame, every idea, every vision, every detail I sort of sat in my head for this movie, the soundscape, everything. But I knew that while I was being clear, I was also in danger of being shut off. Like, it absolutely has to be this. But I had enough experience, and this is a mistake that every first-time filmmaker makes. And I had enough experience of watching people make this mistake to be frightened of it. You know, and so I went in thinking, even though I've done all this preparation, even though my North Star is very strong and has to be, I am also aware that what we shoot and what ends up being on the screen is going to be nothing like it. And that is okay, because I can make it better. I can make it better than the thing in my head. And I think it's about interacting with your collaborators, receiving their wisdom in an atmosphere of generosity. Even when I was being stubborn and intransient and telling people no, I would try to do it in a gentle and generous way, because then I don't want to frighten that person from having another idea, because the next idea I may well receive and say, hooray, this is the best idea, everyone. This is great, let's go with that. So I never want to shut anyone down. And I think that was very important. Like, I always tried to be as open as possible in everything that I was thinking about. And I was excited as well. I was excited to see what people brought. You know, there were so many very, very, very passionate people involved in this project who loved it. And that was thrilling, just to support them and see what they came up with, whether it was costumes or the actors or any number of things.
It's interesting you mentioned kind of the observing other filmmakers that you've worked with as an actor kind of make certain mistakes. Was there, aside from what you've just explained, was there anything else that you kind of kept in the back of your mind as either be careful not to go this way, or don't do this, or like, if when I make a film, I'm going to do the complete opposite, or I'm going to do exactly this on the other side?
The best directors I've ever worked with always have the film running in their head. And I don't mean they're trying to copy it, but they're observing what's being shot, and then they're imaginatively imagining what the next scene that hasn't been shot will be, and seeing how it's going to cut together with this scene and the scene after that and the scene before it. And they're always holding, and the edit is shifting in their heads, but they're always holding it. And I think that I saw that again and again and again in common with the best people that I work with. So that was something that I was very aware of. You know, never leave a scene without knowing how you're going to cut into it or cut out of it. It's basic stuff, but actually very important. And also creative. Like, you know, you can get creative about that stuff.
That, I mean, it's interesting you kind of bring up even the idea of editing, because I think it's one of the things that sometimes gets forgotten about how important it is. And it's also, you know, speaking to other aspiring or starting out filmmakers, it's also one of the most surprising and challenging aspects of it. So I wanted to ask you about the editing process of Passive. We spoke about the writing, about the directorial aspect on set, but what about everything that comes after you've got the film in the can, so to speak?
Yeah, editing was really surprising for me because I had done nothing. You know, I'd had experience of everything else. I was like, oh, I know about this. This is familiar. I know what to do. I've seen directors work on set. I've got this. And then you get to the edit and you're like, this is completely different country. I don't know anything about anything. And then you sort of realize that if you're a writer as well, that it's writing again. So it's actually the best part. You know, it's a little bit of an industry secret, but it's probably the most fun editing. It's so creative, it's so full of possibility, and the variables are extraordinary. It's just extraordinary what you can do editing, and I loved that. You know, I'm probably a teensy bit, well, I definitely have obsessive compulsive leanings in terms of detail. And I found myself loving how fastidious you could get about whether or not, you know, using a shot that played on the back of someone's head in the middle of the movie would have any bearing on the final shot of the same person at the end of the movie or not. Fascinating, because it's not just about the scene, you know, it's never just about the scene or even the moment or even the exchange or even the, you know, molecular. It's always the macro with editing, because if you're having a problem with a scene at the end of your film, you can spend hours working on that scene, and then, you know, it's like a light bulb moment when you realize actually the problem is in scene 2, and if you go back and change that, then your final scene looks completely different. And that sort of puzzle work I found very challenging, compelling, but also just miraculous. I mean, I loved it. I could spend my life doing that.
Would they want to come back?
If I knew that, I'd know what race is.
You think they'd be satisfied being white?
Right, who's satisfied being anything?
I am. Satisfied. I am.
Did you find that in that process, in that second writing process, and I always love thinking about editing as a second writing process, did you find that the passing you had in your head for all those years suddenly shifted into something different, or was it very similar to what you had envisioned for all those years?
Well, it's funny, of course it shifted, and of course it was actually very different. I mean, if I went and looked at the script that I first wrote compared to what's actually on the screen, there would be, you know, scenes that are not there, things in different order, all the rest of it. But I mean, it didn't feel different, because I think it felt like an adaptation, in the sense that I was just getting closer and closer to the spirit of the film that I initially imagined. Even if I didn't write the screenplay actually in the right way to achieve that, the goal was still getting towards that first kernel of the feeling of the movie that I imagined. So, you know, yes, you have to adapt and change things, but it felt different and yet closer to it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. And I want to kind of to talk, you know, we barely have talked kind of about your directing, working with the actors themselves. And I wanted to ask, especially because you've mentioned the loving the fastidiousness of the edit process and being so protective of the book and the kernel of truth at the heart of the story. What was it like for you to be in this new role, directing actors, and how much leeway would you give them with the words? Well,
I didn't give them much leeway with the words. It wasn't a sort of you can improv, loosen it up sort of situation, because I think the rhythms of it were very important to me. You know, the pacing of it. And I would sometimes, you know, deliberately choreograph scenes that had a lot of dialogue to be in, you know, one shot with a lot of movement. You know, the only example I can think of is when Claire's first visits the house, and then they come up the stairs from the kitchen, and then they go through the hall, and they go up the stairs, and they're talking all the way up into the other bedroom. So a lot of that exchange is one shot, and there's actually tons of dialogue. And it was deliberately choreographed that way because I didn't want it to be drawn out. I didn't want there to be an option for it to be drawn out. The rhythms felt very precise to me. And so I wanted it to be spoken in this very constrained sort of way. And I think that helps the themes. I don't think it's how I'd always be. I think it felt right for this. The specificity of the language was important. It's not, actually, a lot of the words in the screenplay are not necessarily period accurate per se, but the pacing gives it, I think, a period feel. Like, they speak very fast. It's very erudite, but very clipped and very fast. There's no laziness with the language. And that was stylistically a choice. You know, it's not a choice I'd make for every film, but it was a choice, but it meant something very specific for the actors. And I was open with them from the get-go. I said, look, this has some formalities. You know, the movie is about performance, and in a sense, the film has its own performance, its own sort of layer of self-consciousness. And that's quite deliberate. So that means that it will be formal. I will need you to hit your marks. The 4:3 aspect ratio means that if you don't hit your marks, there's a strong chance that you might not make it into the shot. So it's skinnier than other films. And I need you in a 2-shot a lot of the time. So I would be very specific about blocking. And I loved giving them stuff to do always, because it felt more embodied in many ways. And it's also a chance to find the sort of counter narratives. You know, there's the narrative that they speak, and then there's always this counter narrative of the subtext underneath. And a lot of that comes with gesture and things, objects, things, external things like a crack in the ceiling, flower pot, all the rest of it, hands, mirrors. But also, you know, specific choreography allows for glimpses of the two women, for example, being able to look at each other without the other one being aware that they're being looked at. So that boils down to choreographing ways in which they're sitting side by side, or which happens a lot with Brian as well, versus the times that they're actually face on. Again, always to sort of like find the counter underneath the thing. So, but I always would say to them, this is what I'm trying to achieve. You know, this is why. I wouldn't say do this without an explanation. I think it's very important to let them in on what your goals are, you know. And I would always say, if it doesn't work, if it feels terrible, there's something wrong with it. Because if you as an actor feel awful, like truly terrible, like you can't do the scene, it doesn't make any sense, and you feel completely hemmed in by how you're being forced to stand, the scene is never going to work. Never force an actor to go any further. Find a different solution. But I would say, within this framework, if you can give yourself complete emotional freedom, I have no idea what you're going to do within this framework. And I'm excited by that. Give me everything you've got. And if you're not comfortable, we'll change something about the blocking. So it was this sort of weird combination of being very restrictive, constrained, very specific, but also wanting to give them complete creative power, ultimately.
Yeah, it's the you know, when you have very specific constraints or limitations, you have to think a lot more creatively. And I wanted to talk now about the kind of the second life of the film. Once it's done, it's finished, it's locked, and it's out in the world. You know, you kind of alluded to it before, this other, you know, there's a persona of the director when you're pitching it and striving to get it made. And then once people, strangers all around the world, especially when it lands, you know, in a global streaming service, kind of seeing it and reacting to it. What is that experience like for you?
We've got to summon back the persona, because I mean, the truth is you're sort of sitting there like, you know, chewing your fingers off going, oh my God, so many people are watching it. What am I? But you can't, you know, you've got to go out and advocate for your movie in a different way. Like you had to pitch for it before. You've got to go out and meet the press and, you know, be like, everything's fantastic and it's great and I love it. I mean, you do have to do that, and it's good for the film and it's important and it's another layer, and you do want to celebrate it because you've come so far. I will say that the thing that nobody told me that was the biggest shock was how much stamina you need. I knew that I had, like, once the train had left the station, we were, you know, every day it's like, am I going to get everything in the can? Did we make the day? And then when we got into post-production, you know, are we making the schedule? Have we got the cut? Is it where we want it to be? Got to hand it in on this date. We're running out of money, etc., etc., etc. That requires an enormous amount of stamina. Then the film sells and you're like, hooray. And then suddenly there's all of that, like doing the sale, talking to people, blah, 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 blah. And then the film starts going out and you have to do all the press. And you haven't stopped, and the whole process can be 2 years, and you're just running and running and running and running and running and running and running, and the stopping point seems to get further and further away. You know, if you're successful and it goes well, you keep on doing it. But I had no idea how much stamina I would need to just keep going to the invisible finish line. I'm like, when does this process actually end? Like, when is the movie out in the world and I can stop and go to sleep? I don't know. I still feel like I haven't been there yet.
But I imagine one of the most kind of rewarding / terrifying aspects is people reacting to it. And, you know, not industry people, not, you know, the press necessarily, but real people watching it openly. What have been some of the most moving reactions that you found, both kind of on the circuit, on festivals and stuff, and once it's been online?
Well, I'm not very online, so I have no idea about that. I know that there's a world out there that I could engage with, but I'm not really doing that for my own mental health. And but I do a lot of Q&As, and I actually love doing them, and I love having the opportunity to have that dialogue with people in the audience and seeing people having, you know, just being in a place where people can come up to me afterwards and say something. And I have been just blindsided by the response. It's not, I don't know, you sort of end the process. And so many people have come up to me in tears saying, I've never seen something like this before. And it's not, and it's everybody. I've had, like, you know, an elderly white man come up to me and say, you know, my grandparents rather were, or someone in their family, I can't remember, were Holocaust survivors, and I related to this because of assimilation, and, you know, just very surprising things. And other people come up and tell me their stories, whether it's as it relates to the sort of queer subtext or as it relates to the race overtext. It's endless, the things people come and say to me. And it's always very emotional, and it's always very urgent, is the only words that I can quite find to articulate it. I feel there's an urgency, like there's I felt an enormous sense of gratitude from people that finally there was something that was a bit different, and they didn't know they were looking for this film, but then they found it. And there was this sort of urgent, like, I needed this. I didn't know I needed this, but I needed this. And that's intensely moving, because you don't know if it's going to strike a chord with people. And if it doesn't, it's actually all right too, because if it strikes a chord with you, that's all that really matters. But you get into that mindset when you're making it, because you have to, of like, this, in the same way that when I first wrote it, I convinced myself that this was for me. When I was in post-production, I think I did the same thing. I was like, I don't know if anyone else is going to respond to this, but this is how I like it. And this is what I care about. And it matters to me. So it's very tiny. And then suddenly it becomes this thing where you notice that other people are having these very personal experiences with it that have nothing to do with me. And the film is so much actually bigger than me now, because it means it resonates to people's stories that I don't know about, to things that I haven't thought about. It exists far outside of me now, and has a life and a meaning that is all its own. And that's really what the most you can hope for. And also, it's really the moment when you have to let go of it. Like, it's not actually the finish line. It's not, you know, now I'm saying it, it's not actually someone saying, okay, the press stops here, the film's been sold. It's the moment when you go, oh, this is bigger than me, and it exists without me. It has nothing to do with me anymore. And then you walk away, go find something else to entertain you.
No, it's the moment where it belongs, this thing that you've carried for so long and labored so much over and talked so much about to strangers, to press, to money people, to audiences, suddenly belongs to everyone else.
Yeah.
And I know that you might not be entirely at the industrial press finish line with Passing yet, but we do have to wrap up this. So I wanted to kind of finish off our conversation by asking what you would hope people, and especially I'm thinking of the young and aspiring filmmakers who are watching this, what do you hope out of everything that we've talked about, and everything that you've talked about with your experience in front of the camera and your passion for film in history, and also in the making of Passing, out of all of that, what would you hope that they take away from this? What would you hope stays with them?
I hope that anybody who watches this and wants to make any kind of art gets a little bit inspired to do it their way, because I don't think that I followed a lot of rules, actually. And I didn't really have the good sense, experience, or education to even know that. And I did a lot on instinct, and I think that shows. And I hope that it would inspire people to do the same, because I do think in this moment when so much about the industry is shifting, and there's a real move towards a sort of homogenous art in some ways, that that young people who are starting out on this feel that there's room to experiment and fail. Because I want to see things that are different. I don't want to just be fed the stuff that I know and like. I want to be stretched and challenged as a viewer. And I'm excited for a new generation to do that.
And it's a wonderful note to end on. And hopefully it will inspire more messy experimental filmmakers like Dirk Jarman. Rebecca, thank you so much genuinely for your time and for being so generous as well with your experiences and your thoughts and your insight on directing, on acting, and on cinephilia as well. Not a direction I expected us to go in, but one I appreciate.
Yes. All right. Thank you so much. Take care.
We do have to wrap up now, but we have 3 more days of the BFI Future Film Festival to go, and they're all jam-packed with events, panel discussions, masterclasses, workshops, both online and in person at the BFI South Bank. If you enjoyed this talk with Rebecca Hall, you might enjoy the Friday hotspot with Romola Garai, which will be happening over on YouTube at 5 p.m. Or if you find yourself in London, there are hotspots at the BFI South Bank every day at 1:30 p.m. On Friday, there's Nida Manzoor. On Saturday, there's Craig Roberts and Callum Scott Howells on Sunday. You can buy tickets for all of these and check out what other events are in store at the BFI South Bank or by following the Film Academy social channels.